So by this point, you should feel pretty comfortable with treble and bass clef notation, and maybe even with that movable C clef covering the vocal ranges. I'd like to practice something that you're not going to do too often, but we might as well get it out of the way before we proceed to other things, and that is just practicing the ledger line extensions of these clefs, specifically for the treble and the bass. So the first thing is, let me put the treble clef. I'm going to use these two staves right here. So I'm going to put the treble clef at the start of. Well, once again, what is this thing doing here? I don't want the highlighter. I'm going to put the treble clef up there. I'm going to put the bass clef down there. And I am going to indicate that the music I'm about to make, in this hypothetical sense, is going to apply to both clefs simultaneously. And I'm going to group these staves together. And I'm going to add this thing called a bracket on the left. And once I do so, I want you to kind of imagine that now I've put these two staves together. They're considered a unit. And this thing collectively is known as the grand staff. Ain't it grand? So the grand staff. And here's what this really means. If I ever align, once again, I don't want that highlighter. If I ever align two note heads so that they are aligned vertically, hopefully that looks approximately correct, that means that they are going to be played or performed simultaneously. So just to make sure you're really keeping up with all of this, what is the name of that pitch right there? Well, remember, that's your reference pitch for G4, right? That's the reference pitch, G4, for the treble clef. So that's G4. And what's the name of this pitch right there? Well, similarly, that's the reference pitch for the bass clef. And so that's going to be F3. And because I've got the grand staff, which indicates that these two staves are joined by this bracket, or it's also called a brace sometimes, right? A bracket, sometimes called a brace, doesn't really matter. The vertical alignment indicates that G4 in the treble clef, F3 in the bass clef are played at the same time. That's all. So let's practice with some ledger lines, and then let's just practice making sure that you can readily identify the letters on the respective staves, and we'll call it a day with this particular lesson. So I'm going to put some ledger lines down. This is super exciting, actually. I mean, how much more interesting does a day get than when you get to draw ledger lines and then force people who have no interest in doing this, especially right now on this rainy, why does this keep coming up? On this rainy Sunday afternoon. Probably, I mean, that's where I am at least. It's rainy, it's a Sunday afternoon, and who wants to be worried about ledger lines on a rainy Sunday afternoon? Well, you know what? I do. So here we go. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yes, it turns out I can count 2. 7 examples. And we're going to figure them out together, knowing what we know about the treble and the bass clefs. Okay, so let's see if we can do this. Let's start with number 1. So problem number 1 has a ledger line directly below the treble staff. What is the name of this letter? Well, there are a number of ways to figure this out, right? Let me show you one way. One way is to reference this back to our anchor point, G4. G4 is on the second line of the treble staff. Number 1 here is the first ledger line below the staff. What's the interval between them? Well, that's actually pretty straightforward if you've been following the previous lessons. So second line down to the first line is, well, that's 2 adjacent lines. That's an odd numbered interval size. That's a skip. This first line down to the next adjacent line is also a skip. So we know that 2 skips put together equal a fifth, right? Because it's a compounded interval, 3 plus 3 minus the overlap here at line number 1, and that is a fifth. So the question is, what's a fifth below G4? If you've reviewed those lessons 1 through 10, where you're looking at the keyboard, this should come fairly naturally. Just move down the alphabet, G, F, E, D, C. Because we hit C and don't cross beyond C, we're still in the same octave. So this is C4 or middle C. Okay, good. Hopefully you're okay. If this were a regular classroom environment, I would ask you if you have any questions, but it's not. So if you do have questions, leave them in the comments and I'll get to them. Number two. Number 2 is the first ledger line above the staff. Let's take a look at that one. So if you have memorized, for whatever reason, the range from the first space below the staff all the way to the first space above the staff, then you remember that this is D4, which is actually pretty easy to figure out even now because we already know where C4 is, correct? So a step above that, which is the space directly above, is going to be D4, and that's it. We also know that the space above the staff is G5. Well, how do I know that? Well, let's again look back at our reference point. G4 on line number 2 is a reference pitch for the treble clef. So if I put it right there, that's G4, I should, by this point, be fairly fluid at identifying that this interval is an octave. How do I know? 3 skips and a step. Skip 1, skip 2, skip 3, plus a step from the line to the space above it. That is 1 octave, so therefore, this is G5. This is 1 step below the first ledger line above the staff. So what's a step above G5? The answer is A5. That's it. Let's go on to problem number 3. Now, problem number 3, so that it's clear to you, is the first ledger line above the bass staff. Right? You can see that this is bass on the bottom, treble on the top. Why does this look, or in other words, let me rephrase that. How do I know that this is in reference to the bass staff and not the treble staff? Really, it's just proximity to the staff. You can see that for number 3, this is much closer to the staff below it than, for example, number 1, which is really very close, basically equidistant in terms of the space from this ledger line to the first line, and then from the first line to the second line. I'm trying to maintain the same physical appearance of the space in between the lines. So the same thing holds true for number 3. This line, the first ledger line, is about the same distance away from the fifth line as the fifth line is away from the fourth line, and so on. Okay, so that's basically how you know. It's just about proximity. So how do I figure out what the first ledger line above the bass staff is? Use your references. So I know that the fourth line, I'm just going to redraw it, is F3. Well, let's see. F3 is on a line. This first ledger line note head is on a line, so it's going to be an odd interval size. That's a skip. That's a skip. Well, we've done this before, haven't we? We did it right, sorry about that. We did it right here. So this is just 2 skips compounded, put together, which is a fifth, right? What's a fifth above F3? Take your time. We just go up by step. F, G, A, B, C. Because we hit C, our octave designation changes. So we go from the third octave for F, G, A, B, up a step to C4. And that's the answer to number 3. I want you to notice something really interesting. The answers to numbers 1 and 3 are both C4, which tells us that this interval is a unison, or a size of 1. But notice that they're somewhat differently drawn. And that just goes back to what I started this with, which is if your node head belongs to the top staff versus the bottom staff, it just has to be drawn in close proximity to the staff to which it belongs. So that's a very wordy way of saying C4 in the treble staff is higher, closer to the treble staff, than C4 for the bass staff, which is going to be closer to the bass staff and therefore lower in relation to the treble C4. That's it. But otherwise, you can see that even unisons, if they're using different clefs and different staves, will not exactly look the same, right? They're positioned differently, all in relation to their respective staves. Okay, that was a mouthful, but I think you get it. Let's move on to problem number 4. So remember, for this staff, we're still in the bass clef. So how do we figure out the first ledger line below? Okay, so this one may be slightly trickier, but not that much. Here's what we can do. Let me, in fact, move this. I'm going to use the lasso tool, so powerful. All right, let me move this over here so it's out of the way so I can show you how to work through problem number 4. Let's begin with our reference pitch, which is right there. Got to switch tools. Right there at F3. Well, I need to find my way from F3 down to whatever this thing is below the staff. Why don't I just jump down an octave and land on F2 and then see how close I am to this first ledger line below the staff? How do I jump an octave? Or more precisely, how do I leap an octave? 3 skips and a step. You remember that from previous lessons. So let's go. Skip number 1, skip number 2, skip number 3 lands me on the first line. I go 1 step below. That's the space directly below the staff, which we already know from our previous work is F2. Do you recognize that F2 down to the first ledger line is just one single step? So what's a step below F? E2. And that's it. That's how you can solve problem number 4. You want a longer way of doing it? Count step by step from F3, your reference point, and just go F, and then E, D, C, B, A, G, I'm getting tired, F, and E. And that way you also know that the interval size from F3 down to E2 is a ninth. Well, win-win. We got some more information out of this thing. Okay, terrific. Let's go on to number 5. Okay, still using the bass clef for number 5. So in fact, let me just put that in there in case you forgot. How do we figure this one out? Don't reinvent the wheel, folks. We already know that number 4 is E2 on the first ledger line below the staff. Number 5 is not the first, but the second ledger line below the staff. So we know the relationship intervallically when we have 2 adjacent lines. It's a skip. And since we're moving down, that means we're going reverse alphabetically or down the keyboard or to the left on the keyboard. So what's a skip below E2? C2. And that's it for number 5. Just to kind of mess around with this, always for further practice, can you quickly find C3? 3 skips and a step above C2. So skip number 1, skip number 2, skip number 3, and a step, C3. Can you quickly go from C3 up to C4? I know that we already know where it is, right? I know that that's the answer to number 3, but can you do it on your own staff paper as you're kind of working through these problems with me? Sure, 3 skips and a step. So we're starting with C3, skip number 1, skip number 2, skip number 3, which lands me on the first space above the staff. I need a step above, so I need a ledger line, which I draw. That's the one above the staff, plus a node head right there on top of it, and that is C4. You want to do C5? Okay, you know what? We're going to postpone 6 and 7. So you know what? Here we go. I'm going to lasso this guy. I'm going to move him over. I'm going to do the same thing for number 7. just because they're in the way at the moment, but we'll get there eventually. Here's what I want to do. I'd like to go back to C4, this problem right here, and I'd like to use ledger lines to get all the way up to C5. How do I do it? Well, we know how to do it. 3 skips in a step. So here we go. I'm going to draw a ledger line again, and I'm going to go up 3 skips in a step. So skip number 1, 2, 3, and a step. If I've done this correctly, that should be C5. Let's see. Here's a way to do it. Count this as C4 and just start skipping up. C4, skipping up is E4, skipping up is G4, the next skip up is B4, and a step above B4 is C5. Okay, we've done it correctly. I've done it correctly. Hopefully you've done it with me, and that is C5. All right, since we're doing so well, very quickly, treble clef, where's C5 on the treble clef? So I can demonstrate that unisons may be drawn differently because they're on different staves, because they're represented using different clefs. Just like we did with C4 over here, right? Remember, this is the C4 for the bass, this is C4 for the treble. Let's do the same thing for C5. So where is C5 on the treble staff? How about we start with what we know? We've already done this before, so no need to reinvent the wheel. That is C4 on the treble staff. An octave above that is C5. 3 skips and a step. Here we go. Skip number 1, 2, 3, and a step. That is C5 on the 3rd space of the treble clef or the treble staff. And so these two C5s are a unison in relation to one another, right? Same letter, same octave designation. But of course, one looks really easy to read, as in C5 here on the 3rd space, and one looks very challenging to read, which is C5 over here on the 1, 2, 3, 4 ledger lines and a space above the bass clef. Well, listen, if I were you, I would definitely go for this one, not for this one, because one is complicated to read. It requires a lot of counting of those extra ledger lines, and the other one doesn't. So this is a good lesson for you, for all of us. If possible, notate on the staff. So if you have a choice between using lots of extra ledger lines or changing clef and writing something on the staff, go for the latter, right on the staff. I mean, don't go for the ladder, go for the latter. Okay, did you get that pun? That was such a, like it looks kind of like a ladder. Yeah, like a ladder. Get it? Okay, you know what? I'm going to just pretend that joke didn't happen. I don't think anyone understood that. I understood it though. And since again, I'm talking to myself, I guess that's really all that matters, right? All right, I think you guys get it. Let's move on to figure out 6 and 7. And yeah, and I think we're good. I think we've practiced quite a bit here. At the beginning of the lesson, I said that we would practice a lot of staff notation in addition to ledger lines. Well, you know what? In figuring out how to solve all these problems, we've actually been doing so. So let's go on to numbers 6 and 7 and finish off this lesson. So here we go. Number 6 is 1, 2, 3 ledger lines above the staff. What on earth is the label for that note head? Well, I don't know. You guys help me out. See, that's what I would say if this were a regular class environment where I'm interacting with people. So maybe talk amongst yourselves as I do it for you. All right, here we go. I can only do this in reference to things I already know. So for example, I know that this is C5 because I've already figured it out, right, from earlier. So maybe I should go an octave above C5 and just see where I land in reference to whatever number 6 is. So let's try it. Okay, so I need to go 3 skips in a step. Skip number 1. Skip number 2. I need a ledger line. Skip number 3 and a step. So this is C5, that is C6. Okay, so C6 is 2 ledger lines above the staff. Problem number 6 is 3 ledger lines above the staff. And so that means it's just a skip above C6, which is E6. And that's the answer. What if you're not satisfied with that method? What if you say to me, yeah, but we figured out C5 kind of randomly from a different problem. What if we were just faced with number 6 without reference to C5? The only thing we know, for example, is our treble reference, which is G4. Okay, fair enough. I hear you. Let's figure it out a different way. So let me erase this and to declutter. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take whatever this thing is, and I'm going to move it down an octave. Okay, so how do I do so? 3 skips in a step. Skip number 1, skip number 2, skip number 3, and the space right below it, and a step. Can I figure this one out? Definitely, because remember my that little acronym for the lines of the treble clef? Remember, it goes like this. Every good boy deserves fudge. Well, that's the lines. We need a space to figure out this one. Remember the spaces? F, A, C, E. This is E. Question is, which E is it, right? What's the octave designation? Well, if you remember, this F on the first space was F4. So it goes F4, A4, C5. We already know where C5 is. It's right there. And of course, E5. So this is E5, which means that if we already know that this is E5, problem number 6 is an octave above. So we come back to the same answer as before, E6. You want other methods of figuring this out? There are plenty. But for now, this should suffice to show you that there are a number of ways to figure out how to label the node heads if you have reference points that you gradually begin to memorize because you're just practiced. Okay, so let's do the same thing for number 7 and call it a day with this one. So we're using the bass clef, redrawing it just to remind you. And let's see what we can do about this. So how about we use the method that we just used for number 6. So I'm going to go an octave up and therefore land somewhere in vicinity of the staff, or maybe even on the staff. Remember, once we're on the staff, things get so much easier. So let's go, 3 skips and a step. So skip number 1, skip number 2, skip number 3, and above that, from the first line to the first space, that is an octave in relation to problem number 7. Okay, I don't know what that is, right? So here's what I can do instead. We all know that the 4th line is the reference pitch for the bass staff, which is F3. What's the interval from F3 down to the first space? Well, it's definitely some even number. How do we know? Because it's a line to a space, right? F3 on a line to whatever this thing is on a space. So a 5th is not possible, a 3rd is not possible, a 7th is not possible, something else. So let's see if we can do this. I'm going to start on F3, and I'm going to go down a skip. I'm going to go down another skip, and we know that 2 skips put together are a 5th. Review the other lessons if you're still confused about that. And then I go one more step to get to the first space. So it's 5 plus a step. Remember, you've got to subtract out the overlap, right? So it's really 5 plus 1, which equals 6. So this first space is a 6th below F3. You can count down if you want, or let's just skip down. I mean, count down by step, but let's just skip down. F3 down a skip, right there, is D3. Down a skip again is, well, you tell me, B, right? A skip below D, so here, let me label them so it's all clear. This is D3. Okay, let me, in fact, erase some stuff because it's getting a little bit cluttered. D3, a skip below D3 is going to be B2. 2 because we've crossed that threshold of C where the octave designations change. And then a step below B2 is going to be A2. So let me zoom in again. Sorry about all the zooming in and out. The first space is A2. And so if we go an octave below A2, then problem number 7, the answer is A1. Huh, you know what? I'm thinking we should do a little more practice. What is the lowest key on the keyboard? A0. You know that from plenty of other examples. So how do I indicate A0 using ledger lines? All right, folks, let's do it. 3 ledger lines down, and this is A1. A0 is an octave below, 3 skips and a step from A1. So skip number 1, skip number 2, skip number 3, and a step. So this is A0. If I've done this correctly, we should be able to figure out the same thing by just going step by step from A1 down to A0. So let's do that really quickly, and then we're done with this thing. So, and it's also good practice for counting down the alphabet, right? Okay, a step below A1 is going to be, there's like no room here. It looks a little messy, I'm sorry. Let me make this a little smaller. It's going to be G1. The next line below that is going to be F1. The space below that will be E1. Don't get bored. Just do it with me. That's the only way this makes sense, right? A step below E1 is D1. A step below D1 on the space below that is C1. A step below that is B0. I hope you agree because we're crossing the threshold of C. It's like some sort of musical event horizon. Once you cross, you never come back. No, you do. You just go back up. B0, and then a step below B0 on that line is A0. That's it. We've proven it in multiple ways. So this was your problem here to zoom out to look how pretty this is. And that is practice using ledger lines on the grand staff for both treble and bass clef. And practice away, repeat this lesson as necessary so you feel comfortable with all of these notational principles.